Okay, hello everyone. Hi, I'm Kiki. I use they, them pronouns, and I work at the Good Ancestor Movement. I'll be chairing this conversation today. Quickly wanted to mention that I'm stepping in for my colleague Stephanie Brobby, who is CEO and founder of the Good Ancestor Movement, and just an incredible force for change, full of love and kindness. And yeah, I just wanted to bring her into the space with us today. Without the support and trust of Steph, I wouldn't be sitting here. I have a very non-traditional background, I guess. I'm very grateful for all the supports she's given me. And yeah, for today, for this panel, we'll be talking, I guess, about the urgency of mobilizing resources, redistributing ownership and power, getting things moving, so to say, liberating capital and power for a just transition to a regenerative economy. And I think this has probably been mentioned today a little bit in some of the conversations we had. And also there was in at least a few sessions that I was able to join, there was some food for thought and action, and I hope that this conversation today can also contribute to that. I just wanted to bring up some mentions earlier. Amaka Akbo from the Katali Foundation reminded us of the kind of analysis paralysis that is in the sector, and the need for us to stop over-intellectualizing the work that we are doing, but instead really going deep and hard. Is my microphone still? Yeah. Going deep and hard into the learning by doing mode. And equally after that, kind of building on that in a sense, Maurice Mitchell also reminded of the important difference that there is between performing social justice and practicing liberation. So I feel this is something I'm going to put on our amazing panelists today. I'll name them briefly. So we are with Kate Poole, Fahad Ibrahimi, Seth Tabachnik, Claudia Garuti, Stefan Binder, and Tim Stumpf. They'll all of us, not me, all of the panelists with us today are progressive wealth holders that are at different stages of their journey and really mobilizing their resources for, in service of ecological resilience, social justice, and abundant futures for all people and planet. So, yeah, without too much further information from my end, I've basically been handing over to Kate Poole first, and then everyone can introduce themselves properly. I definitely didn't do any justice to that yet. And they'll each speak and share their experiences and the challenges that they've been facing along and kind of what they're looking towards in this redistribution and resourcing journey for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then afterwards, at the end, we have some more time for a kind of open conversation together to drill a bit further in some of the questions that surfaced. Without further ado, Kate, handing over to you, if you'd like to share. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. My head looks so big over there. I'm sorry that I can't be joining you in person, but I'm grateful to be on this panel of rad folks working to shift wealth and power. So I'm Kate Poole. I use she and her. I'm based in Philadelphia. And I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, in a white owning class Jewish family. And the money goes back several generations on my mom's side to Jewish immigrants who started a department store and then a hat factory. And the wealth on that side of my family really ballooned through extractive investments, with some of my extended family becoming billionaires and then my more immediate family becoming millionaires. And I grew up having a sense that we had more than enough and I didn't need to worry about money, but I didn't have a lot of the specifics. And my family cares deeply about the environment and justice, and I was encouraged to volunteer and to try to make the world a better place, but there wasn't really a sense of like how we as owning class people, as white people in America, were implicated in systems of violence and harm that had created the wealth that we were benefiting from. And in college, I studied abroad in a Buddhist monastery in India. And as part of the program at the monastery, we read E.F. Schumacher's essay, Buddhist Economics. And that's really where I was inspired by the connection between spirituality and economics, and that it's a legitimate and powerful undertaking to bring our values and our beliefs into our economic practices. And so coming back to the States, I was getting politicized around capitalism being this system that was hurting everyone, that was creating all of this poverty. And I got into local economics, decentralist economics, kind of new economics, next economics. And I started to ask questions about my family and if there was money in my name. And I was eventually given information about 2 trust funds that totaled about $2 million back in like 2011 or something. And so luckily around that time, as I started to push my trustees to give me access to those funds so that I could divest, they were in all these corporate holdings that were doing evil things around the world, you know, Exxon and mining corporations and all, I mean, it was all corporations. I don't really believe that there's like social justice or like good corporations that you can invest in. But I got connected to resource generation. I went to my first RG conference in 2013. And I was really grateful to be there. At that time, I was like in that local economics, new economics space. So there was this emphasis on shifting money out of Wall Street into local small businesses, but going and joining resource generation community really opened me up to seeing the deep need for repair and for reparations and for decolonization. I remember like the first day at the RG conference, there was this movie that they had us watch. It was maybe like a 3 or 5 minute animated video about colonization. It was so scary. And I really just like hadn't taken in all that information. I should really find this video. It was such a pivotal thing for me. It was kind of like a South Park style animation of these corporations and briefcases going to other places and looting communities and stealing wealth, stealing resources. And so shifting and that understanding from me being like a privileged person that wanted to like help other people to understanding the way my wealth and privilege implicated me in these violent extractive systems was like really important for me in my own journey of wealth redistribution and working to redistribute power. And so after 5 years of like doing resource generation, organizing, I was really grateful to be in that peer-to-peer space, but I was really eager to work across race and across class to build the solidarity economy. And so Tiffany Brown and I, we were leading a workshop at an RG conference about centering love and finance. And we would train people to learn about the Ujima Fund in Boston or learn about seed commons and non-extractive investing. And what we were finding is that people get really excited about these investments and then they would bring it back to their trustee or to their dad or to their investment advisor who'd be like, this is too risky, you don't understand, you can't make this investment. And so then the whole thing would get dropped, or like a really small amount of like a big investment portfolio would be moved. And so we thought rather than be in this like what was starting to feel like a futile quest to like train people to get empowered enough to then fight with their advisors or trustees, that we could, Tiffany Brown and I, we could become those investment advisors and just help people walk that more radical path of shifting out of Wall Street into community investments. And I think a struggle for some owning class people and shifting their investments is needing to feel like you are an expert before you can take action. It sounded like Amaka was speaking to this to y'all earlier in the day. And I think like that's a setup, because you're not going to be able to convince your trustee at Goldman that like capitalism is bad. You know, like that's a big project and not one that maybe is worth undertaking, or being able to argue with, you know, with your uncle and prove that all wealth is stolen. And so I think being strategic about figuring out, okay, you do want to learn things and equip yourselves. And also like you can just start to make shifts, start to shift your investments, start to shift your giving. You can listen to your heart or listen to your anger, or listen to these other forms of wisdom and start to take action, and that you don't need to make those moves in isolation. You can connect with peers through groups like Good Ancestor Movement or Resource Generation, and then take that bold and powerful action together. And I think that Farhad's probably going to get a lot more into this, but there's a danger in trying to become an expert yourself as like an owning class person, or trying to like solve poverty. I mean, maybe that's obvious to folks, but like the solutions for these issues are not going to come from wealthy white people, and the communities that are closest to the pain, like frontline communities, that's where these solutions are going to come from. And the solutions are going to happen as wealthy folks can resource and shift power to those communities. But also at the same time, these peer organizing spaces are really powerful. They're a foundation that can support you as you start to work across class and across race to redistribute wealth and power. And so would encourage anyone that's not in community to come into community and be in this work together. And so my wealth redistribution work led me deeper and deeper into questioning these systems around investments. Because while there were so many beautiful practices and experiments that were unfolding in how people were granting and gifting money, we were still seeing that the majority of people's wealth was sitting on Wall Street and still continuing to grow. And so Tiffany and I, we launched Cordata Capital, Investment with a Backbone, in the fall of 2018. So we're almost 5 years old now, 5 years this fall. And we have about 35 clients we work with and about 130 million in assets under management. We're an anti-capitalist investment advisory firm. And so, like I was saying, we don't believe you can invest in corporations if your values include racial and economic justice. And so we support local work through pulling money out of public markets and mobilizing it through gift and investment into local community-controlled loan funds and projects. And we're mostly making low and no interest long-term loans to support community-controlled loan funds, cooperatives, community businesses. We're supporting people investing in Black-led and Native-led and people of color-led funds and businesses across the United States, centering economic self-determination, centering the work of repair that needs to be done in returning wealth in our country. And I'm really grateful to be in this work with people like Farhad, like Amaka and Lena Shalabi at Katali Foundation, like Nikishka Iyengar at the Guild, and Leo Freeman from Seed Commons. I think those are all folks that are there with you in London. And so I'm grateful to them for building these institutions and loan funds that are shifting wealth and power, because then that helps us as investment advisors shift wealth and power to those communities. And I guess maybe a few challenges I'll name is that like organizing family is like lifetimes, it's a lifetime project, you know, like it's not all going to happen today or this year. And so it's a long process, and you need to find community to hold you in that process, to both like hold you accountable and support you in that. So encourage people to kind of take the long view. And then maybe like a challenge name in my work now as an investment advisor is that it's challenging to be in finance. It's a really bleak space, and there's so many assumptions about how money should make more money and about who should be making decisions and about the pace of how we communicate and share information. It's kind of like a hard project to hold on to your values and stay anchored in your values and your commitments in finance. I'm grateful we're a part of like a larger investment advisory firm, Natural Investments, that just converted into a perpetual purpose trust, which is cool. So there are these innovations and structures that are shifting in finance, but still I like have not to this day convinced an investment advisor to get out of public equities. It's still something I'm talking about and something I want people to do, but it's a hard battle in finance because that's kind of the core of the space. And I think also the work of community investing, it can be more time intensive and involved than buying a bunch of mutual funds or kind of what advisors might be used to do. And so I'm grateful to be in community with other advisors, both like at Natural Investments and across the United States, who are investing in the solidarity economy and kind of building out more infrastructure and practices. And I guess I will pause there. I'm eager to hear from all the other folks on this panel too.
Thank you so much, Kate. Yeah, applause for Kate. Thank you. And I'll be handing over to Stefan. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity to share my journey towards wealth redistribution. So, my name's Stefan, and for a very long time, I've been hiding the wealth and the privileges that I inherited from my family. I think there's some like silly examples that include, for instance, me asking acquaintances to drop me off at the corner so that they would not see the big home I was living in, or me owning a small second-hand old car where even like friends and family would make fun of me. But I think it goes even beyond this, because in my professional life, I followed a quite, let's say, traditional path, at least from my class background, in the sense I studied environmental engineering, then I did a PhD, and then I worked as an engineer. And in all of these positions, it was like very easy to pretend that these privileges did not exist, and I could always like drag out the moment where I would need to face them. And reflecting back on this period of my life, I think that several factors explained why I stayed in this position, and I think some of it has already been talked about in the panel on the psychology of wealth. But frankly, I mean, it is a very comfortable position to be in. So you can enjoy the financial privileges while at the same time pretending they are not there, and you don't need to confront them. I think there's also some fears, maybe some more rational, maybe some less rational, but may have some fears about being more open about your wealth, fears about being fundraised, fear of being only seen for your wealthy identity. And Also, I think for me, like personally, there was like a feeling of maybe shame or guilt associated with this wealth, because I'd always felt that it should actually not be mine, and that I basically just won like the birth lottery. And yeah, I mean, it should not be mine because I mean, it has been extracted from people, it has been extracted from the planet, and that people like myself who hold like an incredible amount of power, like through the access to like private wealth that they have, are problematic, to say the least, in a democratic society. And I think I'm also shying away from this potential role as a funder, because I mean I hold like a lot of prejudice against the maybe traditional ways of doing private philanthropy. I mean, I have this cliche of like old white men sitting in a boardroom and taking decisions about issues that they're maybe not affected about, and in the end they are like concentrating again the power in the hands of people who already hold a lot. And I mean, luckily, I mean, since I entered this field, I saw that there's like other ways of doing philanthropy, but at that time I wasn't aware of this. And yeah, so I'd been living like my normal life as an engineer, and given my background as an environmental engineer, I think I had a pretty good understanding of the technical aspects of the polycrisis that we're facing. But I think I was missing like the bigger picture around social justice and around how these issues are all interlinked. For instance, also like how wealth inequality is like directly linked with climate justice. And so luckily, there's an organization that's called Resource Generation, so that Kay had just mentioned. So for those who don't know, Resource Generation is a community of young people with wealth and/or class privileges that are committed to the equitable redistribution of wealth, land, and power. And they do so by organizing young, rich people and using a workshop format. It's called a practice group, which is about political self-education, about the origins of your wealth, and then with an activation aspect. So now that they've been like, they've learned about it, so what do you do about it in order to stand up for social justice? Resource Generation also made me realize that hiding like this wealth and privileges is not helping anyone, including myself, because I'm being dishonest, I'm not being fully authentic in my relationships. And coming back to the title of the conference, I think it's also, I mean, there's like tremendous potential if those resources could actually be unlocked. So what has happened since then? I have helped bring the work of Resource Generation to mainland Europe, because there had been already English-speaking sister organizations in Canada and in the UK. But at the time when I started to be involved with it, there was no German-speaking pendant. And and I mean, this is sometimes it can be like very emotional work, and I think it is important that the work is done in your mother tongue, so that if you want this organizing to be effective. So with the people that we co-created Resource Transformation, so that's the name of it. Can you still hear me? We decided that we would translate and adapt the work to the German-speaking context in Europe. I've also been privately funding different organizations that stand for systemic change. For instance, I'm in the funder circle of the Guerrilla Foundation, also with Claudia. And so Guerrilla Foundation is supporting grassroots movements and activists that fight for social justice, to make it short, and they have like an interesting governance structure where basically there's the funder circle who bring in the money and who are responsible for the fundraising, but then the actual grant-making decisions are not done by the funders, but they are done by an activist council. Looking back, it might look like it has been like a very straightforward path, but it wasn't. Especially I think about the level of, there's some questions that I've been struggling with since the beginning. For instance, about the level of openness that's needed around my wealth. So like 2 years ago, I mean, I'm still terrified, but 2 years ago, it would not have been possible to talk at the conference like so publicly about my situation. Then there's also questions about what role I should have in this work beyond being a funder, and if I should have any role in this. Maybe I should just write the check at some occasions, and then also there's some. I'm talking a lot about wealth redistribution, democratization, but how does it actually look like in practice, and when you want to like implement it? So I think this is like some of the like the major things that I'm like currently struggling with and working on. And I think I'll pause here.
Thank you, Stefan. That's great. Tim.
I'm Tim Stumpf, and maybe I'll just talk a little bit about kind of what steps I'm taking or my wife and I are taking on the redistribution path. And I guess the first step is, this is probably too obvious, but maybe it's sometimes overlooked: stop accumulating. So, the first rule of thumb is if you're in a hole, stop digging. So, walked away from my career in the city in the financial services sector, and so no longer, my wife and I are no longer being financially compensated for our time. I guess with the gray hair, you could say I'm retired, but I wouldn't use that word because it seems like we're pretty damn busy with a lot of stuff. But I guess that's the first step is, we've stopped trying to accumulate. And now we spend our time on a variety of different, maybe I'll talk a little bit about just what we're spending our time on, but then kind of get into what we're doing with our wealth. I'd say most of the things we do in the nonprofit and charitable world are related to social equity and a just transition, to a carbon-free world. One of those things is we spend a lot of time. I'm on the boards of microfinance organizations, which is basically just trying to help people who are locked out of our current system and structure in need of more equitable access to capital. It's not the solution, but it's certainly a path there, including, for the folks in the audience, there's only, I think, one real microfinance charity actually operating in the UK with UK clients, Purple Shoot. So we work with them, I'm on the boards of them. Spend a lot of time with community energy groups, and I think this kind of ties into a lot of what Kate was just talking about. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. But then I also wanted to just reference, and I think there was a session earlier today in this conference about the Patriotic Millionaires group, and so my wife and I have gotten involved there, advocating for things like higher capital gains tax rates and an end to the nonsensical UK national insurance exemptions that give exemptions to high income persons and people of wealth, and advocating for a small wealth tax and I think Farhad's probably going to get ready to be a heck of a lot more articulate about this than I could ever be, but philanthropy alone ain't going to cut it. Philanthropy is quite anti-democratic. As Stefan said, it's insufficient. And if anyone doubts that, here in the UK, just kind of look at what's going on with the NHS and social care and ask yourself if philanthropy can solve those issues. And frankly, it's just another iteration of trickle-down economics, which is, I think we've all seen it's proven not to be a successful economic model. I suppose it's successful for those doing the trickling, but not so great for those being trickled on. So it's not just about philanthropic efforts. It's about taking the position of power that we have, and it may be a cringeworthy name, Patriotic Millionaires. There's a branch in the U.S. as well, but there's got to be some systemic changes as well. And then in terms of kind of what we're doing with our wealth and investing our wealth, certainly, as Kate said, we're clearly trying not to focus anymore on financial profit maximization, which is where everyone's driving people. I guess just as an aside, the pot of wealth that my wife and I have been lucky enough to build over 30 years, kind of started from nothing. It's not eye-watering for probably most people in the room, especially when you look at that dashboard, that digital dashboard outside, and it's clearly breathtaking for 99.5% of the people in the world. But it's not eye-watering or anything for this group. So I'd probably describe our journey, especially given our decision not to be financially compensated for our time and efforts anymore, as more of a kind of a wealth decumulation journey, which includes stopping further accumulation. But we're kind of on a glide path trajectory. And I think one of the tools we're trying to use for that, and again, I think Kate referenced this, is, providing capital, in the terms of, lending and those sorts of things at either no rate or, very low rate, below market rates in projects that, we think kind of clearly advance the cause. And you can do that, you can invest in, you don't just have to donate into, microfinance organizations like Purple Shoots and others. There's ways to invest as well as donate. There's tools such as, and this is not an investment, this is more just the concept of directly decumulating, direct cash transfers, which are, I think, a pretty well proven model, like what Give Directly and others like that do. And then I did want to spend a little time, I guess, on what we're doing with the community energy groups, because I think that brings a lot of this issue about a redistribution of power, and I think it can be extended, to co-ops around, not just in the energy space. That's the one we're kind of focused on, because I've become a fair bit of a decarbonization geek over the last several years. But if you kind of specifically thinking about community energy, and I'm kind of focused most on the UK here, which is where I live, projects such as rooftop solar and wind farms and those sorts of things. The idea is not just decarbonization, it's moving control and financial benefits of energy generation, which is, it's a fundamental need. It's trying to redistribute that from large for-profit corporate utility entities to communities. Obviously it addresses fuel poverty, it addresses climate change, but it's truly a redistribution of power in both senses of the word, and financial property. I would think, people at this conference, I think hopefully in the UK, they're aware of community energy. I think it's a great low risk, true investment impact option. It seems that it should be a standard component in the portfolios of impact funds, foundations, endowments. Not only those who are focusing on combating climate change, but also those who have a social impact as well. It's immediate impact. It's not, let's build a massive green hydrogen plant, and 15 years from now we'll see some benefits. It's cut a check and 3 weeks later you've got green energy at a cheaper rate for people. There's a lot of positive social and community building benefits. There's not many middlemen in the equation, so there's not a lot of fee leakage. Because these organizations are often and largely run on volunteer power. It's a decent financial return for when I'm looking at it with my hat on, as if I were managing an endowment fund, that sort of thing. Very low risk profile. But so what we're doing in that concept is providing very long-term capital at low or zero rates, and then also providing short-term lending to these places who have short-term needs. And I do have to mention somebody I've been working with, and I think she originally was going to be on this panel, and if you don't know her here in the UK, Julia Davies, she's just an inspiring model of how to use one's wealth and position. I'd encourage you to look at her website, wehavethepower.org. It kind of spells out a lot of things she's been doing over the last several years, but it also kind of spells out what we're doing in the community space, because it's an interesting intersection of immediate action regarding the climate emergency, which clearly is kind of one of the top of mind issues around. It diffuses ownership, wealth, financial benefits from that usual tiny minority of wealth holders over to communities and non-wealth holding individuals. I think there's just a big opportunity, and I think there's a big opportunity to kind of further expand kind of the community model, the co-op model. I know it's referred to probably more frequently in the U.S. It's not a silver bullet, it's not a panacea, but I think it's a pretty compelling opportunity. And I think it's a vehicle that, certainly when you're talking about wealth redistribution, I think it's a vehicle that could probably be used a little bit more. And then finally, and then I'll shut up for now. One other thing that's kind of a little bit of a marriage of that we're trying to do, and this is just on a personal level, given our kind of microfinance kind of connections and involvement, we're starting to do a fair bit of one-on-one personal, low or no cost lending to microfinance type clients, people who are just locked out of the system, to try to be able to help people avail themselves of the system that they can't get involved in. But I do think this lending model, that Kate talked about, I think there's a lot of benefits to it. Hopefully you're sending it out into the system. Hopefully, Julie and I are getting repaid fairly quickly, and hopefully they repay, and then we can use it to help other people, and so you can kind of get the kind of repeat benefits on that. So, just a few thoughts on kind of what we're doing early on in our journey with my wife and I. So.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, guys. So we are halfway through, and I hope you're all keeping track of what's been said. There's a lot to take in. I'm going to hand over to Farhad.
Hey y'all, Farhad Ibrahimi, he, him, joining y'all from Los Angeles, California on Tongva land, so all the way on the other side of the United States from Kate, which means that when the conference started this morning, it was 2 a.m. for me. So unfortunately, I haven't been able to attend anything so far, but I was looking through the agenda and seeing Maka Agbo, Dimple Abichandani, Maurice Mitchell, Chuck Collins, Iris Brilliant. I don't know if any of y'all are in the audience right now, but I'm feeling anxious because normally I benefit from being able to hear y'all say really smart things that I can then riff off of. And I was asleep when y'all were talking. So I'm gonna just do the best that I can. I'll start by sharing a little bit about my family. So I'm the radical lefty straight out of central casting in my family. My dad is a successful entrepreneur investor. My mom is on museum boards. My sister went into venture capital for a while. And I'm an anarchist who's been arrested multiple times. But I'm also very much of my family in the sense that both my parents are refugees. My dad is Iranian. My mom was born in Cuba. And this has had a significant impact on both my personal and political perspectives because my parents talked politics all the time when I was growing up. They would yell at the TV when we were watching the news. And you might say they had some strong feelings about US foreign policy. And a consistent theme for me observing was around community self-determination, the way they talked about their respective refugee experiences. It was about displacement, it was about loss of home, but it was also about what happens when community self-determination is undermined by the culmination of generations of outside interventions by the US and others. And I really can't overstate how formative this was for me. Both it helped me make sense of my own experiences as an Iranian American, but it also set me down my own political line of inquiry, where like any good teenager or young adult, I would come home and harangue my parents about why didn't we talk about race more? Why didn't we talk about class or capitalism at all? What is our role in all of this? And meanwhile, there was this whole family money thing looming in the background. My dad had put shares of one of his most successful enterprises in both my and my sister's names, not fully consensually, I might add. I don't think I was even a teenager yet. But by the time I was in my mid-20s, the wealth under my direct control was worth well over $50 million. And I had yet to really reckon with any of it. In fact, I'd avoided it. Eventually, after much deliberation, and really, Stefan, a lot of what you shared really resonated for me, a lot of conversations with working class friends and mentors, I decided to create my own private foundation. And the idea was essentially to create the appropriate vehicle to give away all of the wealth under my direct control, and to do it all within my lifetime. And I want to be clear that the money never felt like it was actually mine, right? I'd learned to question the circumstances that allowed my family to accumulate this much money in the first place. And I see so many great names on the agenda. I don't think I need to go into a long-winded critique of capitalism right now. But I didn't start with a clear framework, right? Ideologically or otherwise, on how to think of the project of philanthropy. So 17 years ago, when the Chorus Foundation, which was this vehicle for my own personal redistribution project, when we began, it was somewhat conventional. I mean, for starters, it was a private foundation. We could have a whole conversation about just that. I was a living donor. I was surrounded by the kind of advice that living donors are given. And I'm sure this is familiar to everybody in the room. Pick an issue, pick a measurable outcome, develop your own strategy to move the needle, and then treat your grantees like service providers to implement that strategy. Now, this didn't really resonate with me, right, as somebody who was raised to value community self-determination. But at the time, I didn't think I really had a choice. So I picked climate change, not because it was the only thing I cared about, but because I'd been told philanthropy could only work on one thing at a time. And so I set out to learn what other climate funders were up to. This was 17 years ago. The results were mixed at best, and that's being extremely generous in some cases. But I'd also be lying if I claimed that we didn't make some mistakes of our own. But we were fortunate enough at the Chorus Foundation, and me as an individual, to show up on a few people's radars, a few peers in philanthropy. And I want to shout out New World Foundation and Solidago Foundation, as well as Resource Generation and a number of individuals and family foundations that were represented there. Folks took us under their wing. We were encouraged to connect with leaders from the grassroots organizing sector. Again, as somebody raised to value the concept of community self-determination, that recommendation really resonated with me. And not surprisingly, we learned a great deal more from frontline Black, Indigenous, and people of color and working class leadership than we were learning from our predominantly white privileged peers in climate philanthropy. And in particular, I want to name a few organizations: Movement Generation, Center for Story-Based Strategy, Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, and Climate Justice Alliance, that were all really, really important to our development. And we saw now that the fundamental challenge of something like the climate crisis, it wasn't the way that our peers in philanthropy were talking about it. It wasn't about identifying the best policy or the most promising technology or the scariest science. It was about power, and not just political power, but also economic and cultural power. So we shifted from that initial issue focus on climate to adopt an overall framework around building and shifting power in the name of community self-determination. This informs what we fund: multi-issue organizations and efforts building and shifting power in the communities that have historically had power wielded against them. So Black folks, Indigenous peoples, immigrants and refugees of color, working class folks more broadly. And our grantees don't just talk about climate solutions or even climate justice, right? They talk about just transition, this approach to systemic change that is centering equity and power at the same time, and leads us to the understanding that systems change all the time. Transition is inevitable, but justice is not. Or a way that I tend to put it, if you're getting thrown under the bus, you don't really care if it's solar powered or not. But it isn't just about what we fund. It's most importantly, I think, about how we fund. Again, I could go way over time with a critique of the philanthropic status quo. I know you all have heard from a lot of smart people, including my colleagues on this panel. So I want to step directly to what looks different about applying a lens around power to one's philanthropy. And I think of this as a path from holding power accountably to sharing power equitably to ultimately finding opportunities to hand over power entirely. And so when I say holding power accountably, part of what I'm talking about is what folks may have heard as described as trust-based philanthropy, right? Making long-term, unrestricted commitments. And I want to say for us, long-term means 10 years. Building open, honest, trusting, and vulnerable relationships with grantees and community members, building trust towards this idea of sharing power equitably. This might be, folks might think of participatory philanthropy, right? Co-designing tactics, strategies, and processes with grantees and community leaders, building processes and structures for democratized decision-making. But this is just the midpoint on the journey, right? This is exercising the muscles for handing over power entirely. For us at Chorus, this means spending down our entire endowment over the last 10 years. In fact, this is our last year of grant making. This will represent the redistribution of all the resources that were gifted to me when I was younger. And we've done things like made equity grants for things like land acquisition, seeding loan funds, organizational endowments, et cetera. But most importantly, one of the things that we've tried to do is support the creation of alternative infrastructure for resource allocation and investment that's held by the community and will ultimately outlive our foundation itself. I mean, I really believe in spend down philanthropy, but I don't believe in fetishizing it as some kind of silver bullet. And if it's really a just transition strategy that we're practicing, then we have to be building the alternatives at the same time that we're decommissioning the things that we don't want. So ultimately, as a private family foundation, I've seen Chorus as a transitional form, right? If we seek to support transformational work, then we ourselves must be open to transformation. And so just transition, this idea applies equally to the philanthropic sector itself. I'm sure Justice Funders has already gotten a lot of love today. I would just like to underline that love. They've been hugely influential on us. And just want to name that, one of the things we talk about in these conversations is a just transition for philanthropy requires explicitly and directly challenging the conditions that produce the wealth inequality that allows for private philanthropy to even exist in the first place, right? So if another world is possible, and that world is truly equitable and just, then what does philanthropy look like in that word? Would it even be philanthropy as we currently understand it? Or can we allow ourselves to dream of a radically different approach to the questions of resource allocation? So in many ways, I think of myself as an abolitionist, right? Folks may be familiar with this term in the context of police or prisons. I take a similar stance with the concepts that undergird private philanthropy. Good versus bad philanthropy is a useful conversation, but ultimately I'm most interested in helping to build a world in which the resources and the power aren't extracted and consolidated in the first place. And I believe this represents liberation, not just for our grantees, but for all of us, right? Including me. So some of the questions I'm wrestling with now at this point in my trajectory is like, what does it really look like to strategically decommission philanthropic organizations? I've had an experience with one, right? That doesn't actually make me an expert. That just makes me somebody who's done it once, right? But also, what does it really look like to organize, not just fundraise, right? To build a base of transformative organizers within the philanthropic sector itself. And then something that honestly, I love that our faces are giant in front of everybody right now, Kate, because I've learned so much from you over the years. What does it look like to apply the same line of inquiry to investment? And so I'll close out there. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much, Farhad. Yeah, Claudia.
Thank you. So I will share with you my early stage of redistribution and what I'm doing, and before, just a little introduction on how I got here. I grew up in Italy. I spent my 20s here in London. I had lots of fun, and so happy to be back. And now I've been living in Vienna for 10 years. I grew up in a family that, first generation going to university, father becoming an entrepreneur and responsible for me sitting here today. And there was always this sense that we had a normal life, that we were told to be very responsible and very generous, but at the same time, why responsible and generous towards what? So there was lots of ambiguity and lots of not talking about the elephant in the room, which is wealth. So in this ambiguity, though, I always felt this being in between and this being a bit of a bridge. And I think, luckily enough, I understood that the word was not just, and I was just living under a lucky mushroom somehow. And I've decided to do something about it. So I've started to squat the school and march in the street. And then eventually, when I worked here in London, I worked in the arts that I was sure was going to change the world. That didn't happen. Then I went to business school because I wanted to do social business and work on sustainable fashion. That didn't change the world. Luckily, I then joined Ashoka and learned from incredible social entrepreneurs about system change, and eventually started to work with movements on advocacy. And campaigning, especially in Italy. But this just to say that all of these efforts that I've done, that was great. And I mean, I worked for amazing organizations. I always felt that I wasn't really having the impact I wanted to see, and I wasn't in the right place. And I understand only now that, my humble approach of hiding wealth was actually not helping, because this is part of my story and part of what I bring and part of where I sit now, and with the privilege and the power and the access to things that this means. And in a sense, you're part of all of these efforts to change the world, but then you finally understand that wealth is very much part of the problem. And so if you want to do something about it, you have to bring it in and start to see how it can be part of the solution. But it took me a long time. I inherited a few years ago, and it took me a long time to think that this thing was mine and I could do something with it. And I actually have to thank people like Farhad. I read an interview a few years ago, and Anthony Schwartz, that is the founder of the Guerrilla Foundation. And all of a sudden, I was reading stories of people who were taking their means and doing something radical, something that would challenge their status quo. And I was like, wow, you can do that? That's amazing. So I started a journey and thinking, could I maybe do that one day? And eventually, about a year ago, I joined an organization called Generation Pledge that asks inheritors to donate at least 10% of their wealth within 5 years of inheriting. And this was for me very important because it was a bit of in a sense, I hated the fact of being called an inheritor. I was like, what's that word, But it was very important because finally I gave myself permission to really embody who I am and to do it with other people that had the same questions. And more importantly, I was told all my life that I had to accumulate. If I didn't really manage to accumulate, I should preserve. And if I didn't even manage that, let's at least be a great entrepreneur. But finally, I freed myself and I decided not to do any of these things and decided that my life is indeed about giving. And yes, my redistribution now, it's very much about the imperfect world of philanthropy. And I just would like to, this morning there were talks about the shame of the privilege, and I think this is very important. I've just done the Reimagining Wealth course with the Good Ancestor movement, actually with Kiki. And I think Kiki can say that I finished every session saying, I want to go back to my cave. I don't want to know about this. I don't want to know about these problems. I don't want to know that, that I'm so much part of the problem, but that actually there are so many solutions. And the shame is that you're never going to get it right. And that, you can always get somebody pointing the finger for what you signify, what you represent, and that whatever I'm telling you here is actually not the answer. It's a very, very imperfect approach. But at the same time, I was also very inspired this morning by talking about scarcity and abundance. And I think, when you are in the cave and you think, oh my God, I'm not good enough. I'm not going to do it. I can't do it. This is so bad, you freeze. And you don't do anything. And when you start to ask yourself, what can I do more of today, that can bring me further, then things start to happen. And so my imperfect journey, actually, I reflected today. I got so many inspiration today. Iris today talked about wealth being the great disconnector and about the barricade. And how when you open up the barricade, you start to connect. And I found this was very, very beautiful. And it actually made me reflect that everything I do is about connecting. Maybe it's because I was always in this in-between, that I didn't know where I stood, and that I really get angry when I see when people, all of us working in silos, and the fragmentation there is also in the social world of we're all working together for change. Actually, not so much. And so this really frustrates me. And my own personal philanthropy is all about supporting movements, but also supporting those organizations that help collaboration across sectors, that help advocacy, and that help a real conversation between how we enable communities and social movements, but actually how we also bring the voice to the top, and how this then trickles back down in significant change within our communities. I've also started to work on creating in Vienna very small interventions called circles, where we sit around circles, it's a very ancient tradition. I really didn't invent anything new, but it's amazing what happens when peers working on similar areas, or people from diverse background, roles, generations sit together, and you're finally creating a space that is open, that is vulnerable, and where everybody counts as one. And I think also what is the power of these spaces is that we all hide and we disconnect, saying, anyways, what I do doesn't matter. And when you sit all together, actually, you matter. And I think it's also a great way of giving the sense of agencies also of other wealth holders and people in leadership positions. So we have to get a bit open and a bit more naked in front of one another. And then the last thing is that I have the great privilege of running our family foundation, Better Way Foundation, together with Clara, who sits somewhere here. And I think, to be honest, we started 2 years ago, and we did some things, but we had the honesty of saying we actually don't totally know what we're doing. So we went to Impatience Earth and to develop a climate change strategy. And we did. We have a great 2-pagers about climate justice with a gender lens around the land regeneration. But on top of these fancy titles, I think what we've really learned and started to practice is to, we still have a board and we still make decisions, but I would say that the moment we find partners we talk to, we let them decide what they invest the money on. And our only question is always like, what do you need? What do you need that no one else is funding so that you can really jump and bring change in your community? So in a sense, we're trying to totally detach ourselves from matrices and from having any say on how and where the money we decide to disperse go. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. Thanks. And yeah, to our last one, Seth.
Hi. My name's Seth Tabatsnik, and I am the funder and co-founder of Be the Earth. And really the name is what it is about. It's a call to action to be the earth. And so much of our work is not what we do, but how we do it. So I just wanted to start by acknowledging what I believe is the context that we're in. And you talked about circles. I would love for this to be a circle. I'm so aware of the intelligence of not only every individual in this room, but the intelligence of the collective and the ancient technology of circles. Also, just to name, I love sitting outside and including the trees, the birds, the insects, and the intelligence that they bring when we sit in circles outside. And I'm aware that this room is a human-centric room, and so there's a level of intelligence that comes more from the mind when we're in a space like this. And a lot of our work is around systems change, and I understand the reasons why we're in this room, and the convenience and the lifestyles we all live, and we're very busy, and it's hard to organize something that is outside and in nature because maybe less people would come. But that's also part of the work. And so, I would love as a call to action to see something like this outside at a festival at some point, or some kind of format where we can include other beings other than human beings. So a lot of the work we do really started from this root belief that capitalism as an economic system prioritizes profit maximization ahead of anything else, externalizes people and the planet. And what we believe is that we need economic systems as opposed to one system that are local, decentralized, and ecocentric, that prioritize life ahead of profit. That was kind of the statement we put out, and we didn't really have all the solutions. We don't have any of them, maybe. Still working on that. And we call ourselves experimental, because really everything we're doing is a constant experiment and constantly learning by doing. A lot of our work is focused around women and indigenous communities. Women, because we know that women know how to bring life into life, and because we are part of Mother Earth. And indigenous communities, because they've been practicing ways for thousands and thousands of years that know how to live in harmony with self, nature, and others, and in fact are not separate from nature, neither are we, but sometimes we need reminding of that. And in terms of the decentralized systems and local systems, again, coming back to context, I'm aware that being a privileged person and of wealth, sitting up here on this stage doesn't feel aligned with the work that we're trying to do in the world. And so one of the things I really wanted to do, because we talk a lot about capital, and even in this conference, there's been a lot of talk about capital, and the assumption is that that's money. And even speaking to money kind of reinforces the value of money as opposed to alternative forms of capital. And when we started by saying, okay, so we've got this vision, and let's combine all of our impact investing and philanthropy, our two different financial instruments, under that one vision, and move away from what the rest of my family was doing and that I was previously a part of, which I refer to as financial schizophrenia, which is giving away money on the one hand to things that we care about, and on the other trying to profit maximize with the investments, and saying as a starting point, that's insane. Let's just bring it all together, and why wouldn't you do that? And then the next question was, well, what are the other resources and forms of capital that we can bring? And it almost feels like the easy bit is the financial capital, kind of setting the vision, the strategy, whatever that is. But it's how are we bringing the spiritual capital, the natural capital, and really including other voices into the space. What are we doing with our time, our skill sets, our networks? What's our convening power? And as I said at the beginning, conscious that, we're sat here on a stage and there's so much intelligence, and so what I wanted to do was really invite the voices of everyone in this room, to share their sound. And I asked if I could bring an instrument, and so I did. So what I'd like to do really is, I was imagining a more even split, but everyone seems to be on that side. So I can also feel like some nervousness of being in England and singing, and but that's cool too. That's part of the process. So maybe I can get you all to stand up, because you've also all been sitting down. If you feel called to stand up, please do. You can put your phones or computers down for a minute. You can stand, yeah, sure. So I'll say this third of the room. Choose which side. So this third, this is the note that I'd love you to sing. And the word is home. Home. You can try it. Home. Can't hear you. Home. And this side of the room. Home. And now bringing it all together. Don't forget to breathe. Just keep that sound going. And if you feel called to close your eyes, I'd invite you to close them if you feel comfortable. And just keep the sound going. Oh. We are. We are, 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 we are home. 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 Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that. I always find it refreshing to have a little moment to stand up also, and that was very immersive as well. We have only 10 minutes left, so I hope we can drill a bit further into some of the points. I think there was a lot of shared, I mean, I heard a lot of mention of peer spaces, peer support, peer organizing, the aspect of really opening up that elephant in the room, and also this moment of recognizing, I guess having some kind of moment of seeing the larger, a kind of getting it to a political analysis of the economic system we're in and how that all is tied together to the positions you are in. But I wondered if we can speak a bit more to what it really means to shift power alongside wealth, right? And maybe you can also provide, I really invite you to provide some more concrete examples that would be really helpful for people to just visualize and I guess understand what that looks like on the ground. And also, these are not always success stories, of course, any challenges and obstacles that also have been in the way of that. So I'll maybe go back to Kate, our first panelist, but
sure.
also anyone, open to, it's an open conversation, so I leave it open for people to jump in.
Sweet, thanks. I guess one example I'll share from launching Chordata is that I think when you're entering into collaboration across race and across class, it's important for there to be a foundational resource transfer so that you're not in a situation where, okay, me as a white wealthy person, I now have a collaborator, a working class mixed race Black woman. And then if there hasn't been a resource transfer, so I ended up gifting Tiffany when we were launching Chordata $110,000 because I wanted her to be able to have her own material foundation from which we could then collaborate, and it wouldn't be a matter of, if she doesn't agree with my ideas, then she's walking and she doesn't have the resources. And so I think that can apply to other situations too. If you're entering into a collaboration, what can you do to shift some resource beforehand so that you can have more authentic power sharing on top of it?
Amazing. Are there any further examples as well that come up?
I can speak to, within Be the Earth, we've been experimenting with a sociocratic model where different parts of the organization are have budgets and are autonomous in how they decide what to do. And being the sole funder, I think there's always a challenge of wanting to somehow appease what my vision is. And so even though sometimes I really do want to give up power, the challenge is that people still want to make sure I'm cool with it. So I guess one of the other things is just giving longer term funding. So whether that's multi-year grants or even within our own team, which we haven't been doing, but giving 5-10 year budgets, which would go a long way, as opposed to looking to next year and saying, have we done a good job? I think that's a big piece of it.
I guess not to beat this horse, but the community and co-op model where it's membership driven, not how much you do. So someone who becomes a co-op member for £5 has the same voice as someone, or an endowment who joined in for 10,000 pounds. And I think that, that starts to change the dynamic as well. I think that's I guess a concrete one way of trying to address some of these things. But just throw that out there.
Yeah, I feel Farhad, you might also have some.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that's really stood out for me. So over the last 17 years, Chorus Foundation has had lines of inquiry around democratized decision making and sharing and handing power over in 4 different geographies. And they've played out in 4 totally different ways. But I think something that's been in common across all 4 is just not only that it's, iterative and emergent and all these things that we like to talk about in people-oriented design, but actually just to acknowledge that they've all involved parts that were really hard. They've all involved mistakes. They've all involved course corrections. I mean, I think the process of creating a container and then having people use a container for democratic decision making around the allocation of resources, that is something that the dominant society and political economy denies folks, right, for their entire lives. And so it's like coming in and exercising muscles that we haven't been able to exercise before, our muscles for economic democracy and cooperative economics. And what happens when we exercise muscles we've never exercised before? Our form's not good. We get injured. We get sore. We have to take a break. We have to improve our form. And so I've found it's really important to build in the expectation that those things will happen into the process, into the design, into the stance, into the conversations, into the relationships, into all of it, so that folks are not put in the position of thinking that the funder, the donor, whoever it might be, expects perfection of them, right? Like we're going to just do participatory budgeting right out the gate and it's going to be great and there's going to be no problems whatsoever. That's never happened. And so building in our expectations that there will be mistakes and there will be challenges, and that's actually an important, successful part of the process, I think is really critical.
Thank you. I wondered also on what Kate earlier mentioned about also being, I guess, a wealth advisor in this, and how as a wealth advisor to contribute to this shifting of power, and how I think you mentioned that basically you need organizations as Seed Commons or others to allow you as a wealth advisor to actually do that work. So I wondered if you could speak a bit more to that as well.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like what Farhad was sharing. Like, there's so much infrastructure that's needed. We have all these systems to concentrate and extract wealth, but as we're building out more systems and capacity and leaders and people that are able to redistribute wealth and support economic democracy on the ground, there needs to be like that investment in infrastructure. And so it's not going to be, one group. It's going to take a whole ecosystem of people all shifting resources and dedicating a lot of resources and time to training people up and building systems and practicing that democratic muscle.
Is there, I don't know, I would like to invite as well Stefan and Claudia if you'd like to share,
Maybe I can elaborate a little bit on how, on different governance bodies that we have at the Guerrilla Foundation, which I think is an imperfect but still interesting example of how the power of the capital can be decoupled from and so there's basically the grant-making decisions that are above 10,000 euros are made by an activist council, and on the other hand there's a funder circle. So currently we are 9 people in there, and so we don't have any decision-making power in there. And obviously, it's still imperfect because we could still say we don't want to. We could still pull out at some point if we realize that it's something that we don't want to do anymore. But I think it is one good example of what can be done to decouple this power.
Yes, I'm also very happy to be part of the Guerrilla Foundation, and I think what this is important is to build an example that we can bring in everything that we do. And I talked before, I mean, we try to detach ourselves from the power of how the money is spent, also by giving multi-year granting and by mainly engaging in conversations and not having matrices. But what I also wanted to say is that we also have to face that it's very hard to talk about power. And probably something we should do is to get this dirty word out, because also like in philanthropy, at least overseas, just the funding movement, it's something that people think you're a bit crazy because you don't know what's going to come back and it's going to challenge the status quo of a certain philanthropic sector. So I think it's also important somehow to gently, talk about what money, wealth, means in terms of power, and that somewhere we're still a bit behind in this conversation. So it's still important to spell it out.
Yeah, so it's kind of the elephant within the elephant in the
yes.
room. Another one to unpack. Thank you so much.
Thank
you, everyone. We just managed in time, I guess. But this was a lot to take in, and thank you for sharing so openly the journeys you've been on.